Content warning. This episode discusses domestic abuse, murder, and animal cruelty. Listener discretion is advised. On the 19th of June, 2017, a sheriff's deputy pulled up outside a small farmhouse on Caysid Road, just outside Caldwell, Idaho. He wasn't there investigating a crime. He was there for a welfare check, a routine, almost administrative task, the kind police officers carry out dozens of times a week, usually ending with nothing more dramatic than an awkward knock on a door nobody answers. Nobody answered this one either. But the deputy noticed something was wrong before he'd even reached the porch. Something in the air. A smell that didn't belong on a quiet rural property with fresh paint and a for sale sign only recently taken down. He followed it to a shed at the back of the lot. Inside, laid side by side and covered over, were 3 bodies, so badly decomposed that it would take investigators weeks, in some cases months, to work out exactly who they were. What they'd find, piece by piece, over the following months, was a story about a man who had spent years running 2 entirely separate lives at once. A husband in one state of mind, a devoted boyfriend and father figure in another, and what happened the moment those 2 lives finally, catastrophically collided. He is still, to this day, considered a fugitive. Part 1. 2 lives to understand how 3 people ended up dead in a shed outside Caldwell, Idaho. You have to go back a few years, to a man who, on paper, and to almost everyone who knew him, looked like exactly the kind of steady, capable person you'd want in your life. Gerald Michael Bullinger, who went by Mike, was in his late 50s by 2017. He was a pilot and an outfitter, the kind of confident, outdoorsy, self-sufficient man who knows how to fly a plane, guide a hunting trip, and fix whatever breaks around the house. He'd spent years living in Montana before eventually settling in Ogden, Utah. And for nearly a decade, he'd been married to a woman named Cheryl Baker, a retired schoolteacher remembered by the people who knew her as artistic, kind, and gentle. Friends who'd watched Cheryl and Mike together described what looked, from the outside, like a genuinely happy, stable marriage. They were, by most accounts, planning for retirement together. In May of 2017, the couple had purchased a small farmhouse property outside Caldwell, Idaho, with the intention of eventually relocating there once Cheryl finished out her teaching career. At the exact same time, in the exact same city of Ogden, Utah, Mike Bullinger was also in a relationship with another woman entirely. Her name was Nadja Medley. Nadja was a single mother in her late 40s, raising her 14-year-old daughter, Payton, largely on her own after the death of her husband, Mike's own brother, Tom, back in 2014. Nadja had known real hardship in the years leading up to meeting Mike, and by every account from the people close to her, meeting him felt, for a while, like her life finally turning a corner. He was fun. He was kind. And crucially, he became a genuinely important figure in Payton's life, the kind of steady, present adult a grieving teenager badly needed. Friends and family have since been consistent and emphatic on one point. Nadja had absolutely no idea that Mike was married. She'd been told and believed completely that he was divorced. For close to 2 years, Mike Bullinger maintained both of these relationships simultaneously. A wife in one part of his life who believed she was building a retirement with him, and a girlfriend and her daughter in another part of his life who believed they were building a family with him. 2 women who, by every account gathered afterward, never had any reason to suspect the other existed. In May of 2017, that carefully separated double life began, almost inevitably, to collapse in on itself. Mike relocated Nadja and Payton from Ogden to the newly purchased Caldwell farmhouse, the same property he and Cheryl had bought together only weeks earlier, with the same plan of eventually retiring there. It's still not entirely clear, even now, exactly how Mike intended to keep managing two separate households converging on the same physical address. What is clear is that it didn't hold together for long. Part 2. The farmhouse for Nadja and Payton. The move to Caldwell in May 2017 looked, from every outward appearance, like the start of a genuinely good chapter. A small farmhouse property. Animals around the place, dogs, and other pets that made it feel like exactly the kind of settled, rural life a mother might want to build for her daughter after several difficult years. Mike Bullinger, in this version of events, was the fun, kind-hearted partner who'd helped make that possible, and a steady father figure for a teenage girl who'd lost her own father far too young. Sometime in mid-June, that fragile arrangement came apart. The precise details of what happened inside that farmhouse remain, to this day, known only to one person, a person who has never been located to explain it. But investigators have been able to piece together the broad shape of events from forensic evidence, from witness accounts, and from the timeline of Cheryl Baker's own movements in the days before she died. Cheryl, still living in Ogden, and still under the impression that she and her husband were preparing to retire together to their new Idaho property, is believed to have traveled to Caldwell sometime around the middle of June, arriving, by most reconstructions of the case, unannounced. Whether she'd grown suspicious, or was simply making a spontaneous visit to check on renovations to a home she just bought, isn't something investigators have ever been able to definitively establish. What does seem clear is that when Cheryl arrived at that farmhouse, she found Nadja and Payton already living there. Two women who had never known about each other, meeting for the first time, inside a house that both of them had every reason to believe was theirs. What happened in the hours that followed ended with all three of them dead. Cheryl Baker, Nadja Medley, Payton Medley, 14 years old. Each of them killed by a single gunshot wound. Their bodies were placed together in the shed at the back of the property and hidden beneath a covering, where they would remain, decomposing, for weeks before anyone found them. It's worth pausing on the sheer, deliberate coldness of that detail. This wasn't a crime scene abandoned in a panic. Someone took the time to move three bodies into a single structure, lay them side by side, and cover them. A level of composure, in the immediate aftermath of killing three people including a child, that's genuinely difficult to reconcile with the fun, kind-hearted man so many people described knowing. And there was more waiting to be found on that property, besides the human victims. When investigators eventually processed the scene in full, they discovered several dead birds and dogs, believed to be family pets, along with other animals, including a snake, a rat, and rabbits, still alive and in need of removal during the subsequent investigation. Whatever had happened at that farmhouse in the days before the discovery, it had left almost nothing on the property untouched. Part 3. The welfare check. Nobody heard from Cheryl, Nadja, or Payton for weeks. In a world before constant digital check-ins were quite as expected as they are today, that kind of silence could, for a stretch, be explained away. A difficult move, patchy cell service in a rural area, people simply heads down in the business of relocating their lives. But eventually, the silence became too long to explain away. Cheryl's brother, Byron Baker, hadn't heard from his sister in roughly 2 weeks and grew concerned enough to report her missing. Around the same time, friends of Nadja's back in Utah began telling a strikingly similar story, weeks without contact, an unsettling quiet from a woman who would ordinarily have been in regular touch. It was one of Bullinger's own relatives who eventually called Canyon County authorities in Idaho and asked for a welfare check on the K-Sid Road property. A decision that, however painful its outcome, is very likely the reason this case was ever solved at all, at least as far as identifying who was responsible. On the 19th of June, 2017, a Canyon County Sheriff's deputy carried out that welfare check and discovered the scene at the shed. What followed was one of the more grim and painstaking forensic identification processes in recent Idaho criminal history. Given how advanced the decomposition already was by the time the bodies were discovered, visual identification simply wasn't possible. Investigators turned instead to DNA evidence, drawn from personal items known to belong specifically to each of the missing women, along with, for one of the victims, dental records. Cheryl Baker, 56 or 57 years old depending on the source, was identified first through dental records by the end of June. It would take until early August for investigators to positively confirm the identities of the remaining two victims, 48-year-old Nadja Medley and her 14-year-old daughter, Payton. For three separate families, that meant three separate, staggered waves of the worst news imaginable, spread out across roughly 7 weeks, each confirmation reopening the same unbearable question for people who'd spent that entire stretch hoping, against increasingly poor odds, that this wasn't how the story would end. Part 4. The manhunt. By the time investigators had processed the scene at the farmhouse, one name was already at the center of the case: Gerald Michael Bullinger. He owned the property. He was connected to all three victims, husband to one, boyfriend to another, father figure to the third. And he was nowhere to be found. Authorities quickly issued a warrant, initially charging Bullinger with the comparatively narrow offense of failing to report the deaths, a charge that would soon be escalated once forensic identification was complete to 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was formally named a person of interest, then a suspect, then a fugitive, in a case that rapidly became the subject of a nationwide manhunt. Bullinger, authorities stressed publicly and repeatedly, should be considered armed and dangerous. What made the manhunt especially frustrating for investigators was the head start Bullinger had already built into the case almost by accident. Because it had taken so long for the bodies to be discovered, and longer still for them to be identified, Bullinger had effectively had somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks, possibly more, to disappear completely before his name was ever connected to a triple homicide investigation. His car, a white 2007 Ford Focus registered to Cheryl, wasn't located for close to 3 weeks after the initial discovery of the bodies. When it finally was found, it turned up a considerable distance from Caldwell, abandoned at Pacific Creek Campground, inside Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest, an enormous, rugged wilderness area bordering Grand Teton National Park. Investigators established that Bullinger had been seen entering Grand Teton National Park through its Moran entrance in mid-June, placing him, credibly, in one of the most remote and physically demanding landscapes in the American West, at almost exactly the time his 3 victims were being reported missing back in Idaho and Utah. It's a detail that matters enormously to how this case has been understood ever since, because Bullinger wasn't simply a man on the run who might blend into a city or slip across a border. He was, by every account of the people who knew him, deeply experienced with wilderness survival, a pilot, an outfitter, someone who had spent a career being genuinely comfortable and capable in exactly the kind of terrain his car was found abandoned in. Federal, state, and local agencies poured resources into searching the Bridger-Teton wilderness for weeks. They found nothing. Search efforts were eventually scaled back, though never formally closed. In the years that followed, the case would be featured on national television programs, including In Pursuit with John Walsh, generating hundreds of tips from members of the public across the country, none of which have ever led to Bullinger's confirmed location. Part 5. What remains unknown. Here's the strange, unsettled place this case occupies, even now, close to a decade later. Investigators have told the victims' families, on the record, that they consider the case solved in every sense, except the most literal one. Canyon County Sheriff Kieran Donahue has stated publicly that the forensic evidence strongly implicates Bullinger in all 3 killings, and that he is presumed dead, most likely, according to the working theory, through suicide, exposure to the harsh conditions of the Wyoming wilderness, or a fatal encounter with wildlife in a genuinely dangerous stretch of backcountry. And yet, the case cannot be formally, completely closed, because Bullinger's remains have never been found. No body. No DNA confirmation of death. No definitive answer to the question of whether a man experienced enough to survive for years as a wilderness outfitter might have used exactly that expertise to disappear entirely, rather than perish in the landscape he knew better than almost anyone. That uncertainty has taken a real, ongoing toll on the families left behind, an entirely different kind of unresolved grief from a standard homicide case, where the person responsible is, at minimum, known to be either dead or in custody. Relatives of Nadja and Payton have spoken publicly about watching hope curdle slowly into frustration over the years, the particular exhaustion of a case that everyone agrees they understand, without ever actually being allowed to close it. It's also worth returning, before we finish, to the two people at the heart of this case, whose story so often gets flattened into a footnote in the larger, more sensational manhunt narrative: Nadja and Payton Medley. Nadja had already survived the loss of her husband and rebuilt a life for her daughter under genuinely difficult circumstances, only to find, apparently, a second chance at happiness with a man who was never who he claimed to be. Payton was 14, a kid who, by every account from people who knew her, was doing well in school, adjusting to a new home, trusting a father figure who had stepped into her life at exactly the moment she needed one. Cheryl Baker, for her part, had spent a career as a schoolteacher and was, by every account from her friends, a genuinely gentle and artistic woman looking forward to a well-earned retirement on a small property she and her husband had chosen together. She had no idea, right up until the final days of her life, that the man she'd built nearly a decade of marriage with was simultaneously building an entirely separate family, in an entirely separate life, that happened to be converging on the exact same address. 3 women. 3 completely different relationships to the same man. 1 farmhouse, 1 shed. And, at the center of it all, a man who has now spent close to a decade as one of Idaho's most notorious unsolved fugitives, either surviving somewhere, still, on skills few people possess, or lost somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of western Wyoming, in a mountain range that has so far kept whatever became of him entirely to itself. If you have any information relating to the whereabouts of Gerald Mike Bullinger, you're encouraged to contact the Canyon County Sheriff's Office or your local law enforcement agency. Thank you for listening.